Dr. David Levine recorded this narrated PowerPoint on February 6, 2015.
Hi, I'm David Levine, and I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about the origin and early history of the Scoliosis Research Society. The reason why I am the one that is discussing this is that I had proposed such a society in 1964 at a workshop on scoliosis led by John Moe in Minneapolis. I'd like to begin by talking about Russell Hibbs of New York Orthopedic Hospital. It is thought that Russell Hibbs was really the leader of a modern era of orthopedics and scoliosis treatment. Russell Hibbs was born in Kentucky in a small town named Birdsville in 1869 and attended Vanderbilt. He received his medical training at the University of Louisville, graduating in 1890. Now, it's interesting that following his graduation from medical school, he began a family practice in the southwestern corner of Kentucky, but soon after he started, there was some personal tragedy in his life, and he became a recluse, depressed, and dropped out of medicine for a few years. But he was able to rally himself, and he traveled to New York, and he started in a residency program at New York Orthopedic Dispensary and Hospital, which today is the New York Orthopedic Hospital, part of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. So he became a resident surgeon there in 1894. At that time, Schaffer, who had a very well-established carriage trade in orthopedics, took an extended European cruise for a number of months. Hibbs was on staff, and he made a number of changes which, when Schaffer returned, didn't like. So Schaffer went to the Board of Trustees to have Hibbs fired, and at the end, the board fired Schaffer. In 1900, Hibbs was appointed Surgeon-in-Chief of the hospital, and at the age of 29, he had already published 6 articles on different topics of medicine and orthopedics. He was confronted with a number of tuberculosis patients, tuberculosis of joints, tuberculosis of the spine, and in the early 1900s, he published an operation for stiffening the knee joint, arthrodesis of the knee, and figured that if the treatment of tuberculosis has been rest, he could put the spine at rest with tuberculosis, and do so by doing a spinal fusion or arthrodesis. So on January 9th, 1911, he performed a landmark surgical procedure and fused a number of spinal segments for somebody who had tuberculosis. Three years later, he drew on this experience and did his first spine fusion for scoliosis. That was in 1914. He performed over 400 operations for scoliosis, and about half of those were from polio. So he was committed to teaching and furthering orthopedic knowledge, and in 1927 he donated $10,000 to found an orthopedics library that would be available to the young physicians in training. After his death in 1932, colleagues and friends raised an endowment for the library and renamed it for him. the Russell A. Hibbs Memorial Library. It is one of the oldest orthopedic libraries in the United States. The library is housed at the New York Orthopedic Hospital, part of Presbyterian and Columbia University. So Hibbs's name continues in the form of a Hibbs Award at the Scoliosis Research Society. It's a grant which is for the preeminent clinical or basic science paper presented at our annual meeting. Finally, in 1947, the Russell A. Hibbs Society was formed by an orthopedic group continuing medical education and furthering orthopedic knowledge. So I would like to focus on the next phase of scoliosis development in our country. It was in the 1940s and the 1950s. There were few who were treating scoliosis, but there were two giants of scoliosis. One of them was Joseph Risser, trained under Hibbs, and the other one was John Cobb, trained at the Hospital for the Ruptured and Crippled. It is the relationship between Risser and Cobb, or the lack of relationship, that was the seed that started, in my mind, the Scoliosis Research Society. Joseph Risser was born in 1892 in Des Moines, Iowa, and earned his medical degree from the University of Iowa. He served as an orthopedic resident or a surgical resident at the New York Orthopedic Hospital under Hibbs. But he had some of his own ideas about the approach to scoliosis, and as a resident, he began to develop his own innovations in scoliosis treatment. His major contributions to this field were to be the so-called Risser sign, which was the excursion of the ossification of the iliac crest in regards to potential growth left. Also, he had a newer method of reducing scoliosis curves by a lightweight cast, which he called the localizer cast. And finally, he had a method of measuring scoliosis angles, a measurement that he gives credit to developing with Albert Ferguson, another resident under Hibbs. One should realize that we are now only 25 years into the history of medicine when the X-ray was developed and founded by Röntgen. Soon after his formal training in New York, Risser moved to California and started his own practice in Pasadena, where he continued for many years until near his death. In California, he developed the Risser Orthopedic Research Foundation, which made it possible for over 50 young orthopedists from 20 countries to visit him and learn his technique of treating scoliosis. He taught at the Los Angeles Orthopedic Hospital, where he ran the scoliosis clinics, and he participated in the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgery's annual meetings. As far as I recall, in the early years of the formation of SRS, Risser was invited to become a member, and he sent a letter stating that he wished us well, but declined the invitation. He did attend one meeting as an honorary speaker, I think, but I don't remember the year that was. The relationship, as I mentioned, between Risser and Cobb was frosty. Risser had his own ideas. He really didn't appreciate Cobb's approach to scoliosis, and he didn't really care to discuss it with him. As you will hear soon, Cobb had the same feeling. And it was because of this lack of communication that I felt that we needed to have a better platform for discussion, questions, and approaches to scoliosis treatment. In about 1965, I visited Risser and spent a week with him seeing patients. He was a very congenial, warm, and thoughtful person. He treated me like I was a visiting professor, although I was just out of my residency. He never said any bad words about Cobb, but when I tried to quiz him about Cobb, he was very cautious about what he said. After World War II, in 1945, he was joined in his practice by Dr. Donald Norquist, who treated scoliosis with Risser. The two of them continued until the 1970s, when again they were joined by a younger orthopedic surgeon, Bob Gustafson. Gustafson joined the SRS in 1981 and presently is an emeritus fellow and lives in the state of Washington. Joseph Risser died in 1982. Risser's friendly adversary was John Cobb. Cobb, as I had said, had come to the hospital for the ruptured and crippled in 1935, brought there by the new surgeon-in-chief at that time was Philip D. Wilson. And Cobb started studying scoliosis and methods of treating scoliosis and opened up a scoliosis clinic about those years in the late 1930s. John Robert Cobb was born and raised in Brooklyn. He attended the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. At the age of 16, he enlisted on a merchant ship. He studied English literature at Brown and earned his degree of Bachelor of Arts in Literature in 1925. In his senior year at Brown, he decided on a career of medicine, and he attended Harvard University for 1 year of postgraduate study in biological sciences. He then attended Yale Medical School, from which he graduated with his medical degree in 1930. He was a medical resident in orthopedic surgery at Yale after that, and in 1934 and 35 he came to the Hospital for the Ruptured and Crippled in New York, now the Hospital for Special Surgery, as a Gibney Orthopedic Fellow. In 1936, he received a Doctor of Medical Sciences degree from Columbia University. So Cobb was known for a number of facts and new ideas in scoliosis. One of them was the measurement of the curve, the measurement of the scoliosis curve. And that measurement has persisted, the method has persisted throughout the world today. He developed a protractor which he used to give to all his visitors, and it would explain to them in 5 steps how to measure a scoliosis curve. He had a number of mnemonics, a number of interesting phrases and limericks, particularly with his background in literature. One of the ways that he told whether a scoliosis curve was structural or not was by the mnemonic WARP, W-A-R-P. Now, everybody who had studied scoliosis understood that a structural curve had wedging of the vertebra. The wedging was the W. A was the angulation. R was the rotation that occurred, but the P was not understood by everybody, and that is the position. So the position dealt with the balance of the head over the pelvis. And if you look down an AP view of the spine, a structural curve had the apex of its curve past the perpendicular, risen from the pelvis, on the convex side. That is, that the position, the apex of the position of the curve was towards the convex side of that perpendicular, while a non-structural curve had the apex of it towards the concave side. Cobb published very few papers, but one of his two important papers was the problem of the primary curve, which he presented at the annual meeting of the American Orthopedic Association in Hot Springs, Virginia in 1960. It was published in the Journal of Bone Joint Surgery in 1969. At the beginning of the paper, it's interesting that he gives Albert Ferguson, who trained under Hibbs, credit for understanding what the primary curve was. By the 1950s, Cobb's method of treating scoliosis operatively was well known around the world, and he had many visitors coming from other countries and from parts of the United States to spend either a few days or a few weeks, or in some cases a year, with him, learning his methods. So Cobb essentially treated all his severe cases with a surgical approach of a spinal arthrodesis. The usual types of treatment for patients with adolescent idiopathic scoliosis was the use of this turnbuckle cast, which was first developed by Hibbs. The cast was an enormous cast. It extended from the head down to one thigh to the knee. The cast would take about 3 or 4 hours to apply to a patient who was not under any sedation, and the cast was usually applied on a Friday because it had to dry before they could work the cast. So the weekend gave it time to dry out. On Monday, or a couple days later, the cast was cut in two with a large saw, the kind of a two-man saw that cuts down a tree. Now you can think of how apprehensive young patients were going not only into this cast, but having their cast cut in two with this huge saw. Hardware was applied in the form of a turnbuckle, which was bought at a hardware store on one side, and on the other side the part where the hinges were going to go was applied. The patient was in this cast for about 6 weeks in the hospital, during which time every day a house staff member, a fellow, or a resident would come around and turn that turnbuckle to reduce the curve. There was no really pain involved, and the fact that we had maybe half a dozen young girls, mostly, in these casts made for some camaraderie, so that it was easier for these teenagers to fathom this difficult period of time. Surgery was approaching, and when the cast was filled in, ready for surgery, the headpiece was cut down to the chin, below the chin. In the back of the cast, after being filled in, a window was cut out, and surgery was going to take place through that window. The night before surgery, a marker x-ray was taken by injecting methylene blue into the skin, and with a piece of metal over it, an x-ray was taken to show where the location of that vertebra was. The day of surgery, the patient was brought down to the operating room and was given nitrous oxide through a mask, prone, not intubated. Surgery began with local anesthesia, infiltration of xylocaine into the skin, exposure of the spine, never more than about 6 to 9 segments at a time. If more segments had to be operated on, the surgery was done in stages, sometimes 3 different stages, 2 weeks apart. Monitoring was not included. We had no neurological monitoring. In fact, up until 1966, the electrocardiogram was not used in the operating room. Okay. Bank bone was used. At that time, our hospital had a bone bank that was started by Philip D. Wilson and was imitated after he had visited Havana, Cuba, and had seen probably the first bone bank in the country or in the world by Inclan. The bone that was used was of 2 sources. One was sterile bone received from amputations for other conditions, and the other was non-sterile bone received from cadavers. The non-sterile bone was cut into matchstick sizes, and 5 matchsticks were placed in a double plastic envelope, which eventually were all saved frozen and sent frozen to MIT, where their bone was irradiated. So we had our own bone bank, and we used generally those 2 sources of bone, mostly frozen bone. Post-operatively, the patient stayed in this original OR cast for 2 weeks. The cast was filled in, and the patient was sent to a children's rehabilitation hospital in Westchester for 3 months, lying down. At that time, they were readmitted to our hospital. A cast was removed, x-rays were taken, and a new cast was applied, but of limited extent, so that the neck wasn't included and the thigh wasn't included. At 9 months, patient again was readmitted, a new cast was applied, and the patient was taught how to walk, which would take 3 or 4 days on a tilt table. After 1 year, the cast was removed, and the patient did not go into any further external support. Some of the cases retained their reduction, but there were a significant number of cases that lost reduction at 1 year, which was disappointing. As I had discussed, Cobb published very few papers. The other important paper he published was called Scoliosis Quo Vadis? Where are you going? This was published in June 1958 in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. In it is much of his philosophy and approaches to treating scoliosis, how many people around the world, either lay people or scientists or engineers, had written to him about different ideas about scoliosis, about different methods of scoliosis that were used up until this time: the Abbott frame, the Merck-Jansen plaster bed, a bed by Scaglietti in Italy, braces, Hoke corset, exercises. He would always discuss the problem with exercises for the teenager. as you know, it is not easy for a teenager to follow instructions, particularly to do exercises every day. So that he would talk about the fact that after many weeks of the parents trying to get the teenagers to do exercises for scoliosis, and after the patient or the teenager was not cooperative and stopped doing the exercises, then the curve would most likely get worse in some cases, and then the parents would blame the teenager for the curve getting worse. When he had visitors come to see his methods, he always gave them three articles, three facts actually. One was the few articles that he published. Two was his protractor that he was proud of and how to measure a curve. And the third one was a rubber mallet that he felt was important when doing a spinal fusion to avoid a lot of trauma on the spine. There's a story that circulated that Cobb was down in the Lower East Side one day, walked into an old antique hardware store, and found a whole carton of rubber mallets. He said to the owner he wanted to buy the whole carton and paid for it and went off. And of course the owner could not understand why he wanted so many rubber mallets. So I've now discussed extensively two giants in scoliosis, Risser and Cobb. And you can see from my approach and view of these two men that they were both really leaders and thinkers in such a difficult field in those years, scoliosis. But it was the lack of the communication between these two which was just a sign of what was going on in the country. The lack of communication, discussion, challenges, questioning of how to treat scoliosis, that made me feel that it was important that we have a platform established to discuss all these approaches to a difficult subject. It is that reason that I decided that I was going to propose a scoliosis organization. Before I leave Cobb, I'd like to leave you with two of his limericks. The first is, you don't have to be crazy to do scoliosis, but it helps. And the second one is, in the field of scoliosis, there's one thing to observe. Keep your eye on the patient and not on the curve. What this tells me is that Cobb, realizing that he didn't have a good handle on treating scoliosis, tried to distract people in his field from direct care of methods of scoliosis. In 1964, I was finishing my orthopedic residency at the Hospital for Special Surgery. I had been accepted as a scoliosis fellow at Rancho Las Amigas Hospital in Downey, California for the next year. I was to attend a scoliosis workshop by John Moe in November 1964 in Minneapolis. It actually was the first workshop that Moe had put together. I was on the bus the night before with Vernon Nickel and told him that I had this idea about starting an organization or a scoliosis club. He was very enthusiastic and told me that he would like to support it, and that during the program I should stand up and make this proposal. The next day, at the end of the meeting, Nick, who was sitting in the front row, stood up, looked at me way in the back, and put his hand up, motioning me to stand up. So I stood up, and I proposed that we start a scoliosis organization. Mo was very quick to accept this suggestion. He hardly approved of this new kind of organization, and he asked me if I would write the bylaws, the first bylaws. At that point, Paul Harrington stood up and pledged $1,000 and said he would design the logo for the organization. And so, the ball started rolling. I returned to New York and discussed my proposition with Philip D. Wilson Sr., who gave me some insight on how to start writing the bylaws and how to start such an organization and what are the different names we could consider. So at first the name the Scoliosis Club was considered. We weren't sure how large this organization would grow to. So after the year of my fellowship in the end of 1965,
the Scoliosis Research Society is a non-profit professional organization
invited
made
a
up of
number of
physicians and allied health personnel.
leaders
Their
in
primary
scoliosis
focus is on
to
providing continuing medical
meet
education to healthcare
at
professionals
the
and
American
on funding
Academy
and
of
supporting
Orthopedic
research
Surgeons
in spinal deformities.
in
Please visit
1966
SRS.org for further
at the
information.
Palmer House in Chicago, and that meeting took place on January 22nd of 1966. There were about 17 members, or 17 orthopedic surgeons, who attended that meeting, and it was decided that the president was going to be John Moe, the vice president John Hall, secretary-treasurer Bill Kane, and the executive committee would consist of those members, those officers, plus Bill Donaldson, Lou Goldstein, and myself and Jacqueline Perry. And the next day, the decision of that group was to call the organization the North American Scoliosis Association. But on January 23rd, at another meeting the next day, the name was changed to the Scoliosis Research Society. The first meeting of the Scoliosis Research Society was held in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota on June 10th and 11th, 1966. The meeting attracted 37 participants from all over North America and ended with a high note of enthusiasm by almost all those attending. Moe appointed a nomenclature committee chaired by Lou Goldstein to come up with a definitive code of terminology. The meeting consisted of discussing terminology and other terms of scoliosis for half a day, and also there were a number of papers, about 6 or 7 papers that were presented in scoliosis. And at the end of the meeting, one of the attendees came up to me to say that he thought we had discussed everything about scoliosis that there was, and as far as he could see, there was nothing more to present at any future meetings. Much credit must be given to Bill Kane, who, as Secretary-Treasurer, our first Secretary-Treasurer, set the foundation in organizing this association. Moe had recognized his excellent organizational skills when he asked him to assist him as Secretary-Treasurer in this new organization. But it was Moe who carried the banner and promoted this organization and promoted education in the field of scoliosis. And along with Bob Winter, David Bradford, and John Lonstein, he founded the Twin Cities Scoliosis Center in Minneapolis, St. Paul in 1974. This became the hub of training young fellows in deformities of the spine. Harrington called him Mo, that is, father of modern scoliosis. So the first order of business was data retrieval, a very big project, and Harrington was very interested in this subject, and he had the background of computer knowledge, and he also had an organization of computers set up. But there were very few computer systems set up in our field. I know that we didn't have a computer system set up at the Hospital for Special Surgery. But we did have another method of retrieving data, and that was through a system called McBee key sort cards. So early in the development of the Scoliosis Research Society, it was decided to use these key sort cards, and they were called Scoliosis key sort card data retrieval cards. All members were obligated to use these cards or provide facts which these cards provided. They didn't actually have to use the card itself, as long as they provided the data from their patients that they operated on an annual basis. The card itself, for those of you that have never seen one of these, is constructed so that the demographics are in the center of the card, and on the periphery of the card are different diagnoses and facts and curve types and so forth. And somebody, one of a staff member, would punch a hole depending upon what the diagnosis was or what the information was, and there were two levels of holes, and if you wanted to retrieve this data, you stacked up these cards, and then you put a knitting needle through one of the holes, and the cards would drop down for what you were looking for. So many of our members resisted this kind of system. They were reluctant in some cases to really release their and review the data of their patient care, and others were 100% against these cards and had no problem in letting me know about that. One of the goals of the Scoliosis Research Society was to bring the name scoliosis into the forefront of medicine, into the forefront of public health, the school systems, and the lay public. People did not know what scoliosis was, on the most part, back in the 1950s and 60s. Some would, but many had no idea what you were talking about. So our first step was to publish some kind of a pamphlet which would be appropriate for young children, teenagers, and parents about scoliosis. Very simply, well, what's that? And we started with this pamphlet. It was a one page, or actually it was one piece of paper that was had 4 pages to it, talking about simple approaches and definitions of what scoliosis was. And we published 10,000 copies of this, and they sold out, or they were distributed around the country, and we published another 25,000 copies, and this was reprinted in German and in Chinese. Eventually, the society developed a more extensive method of marketing scoliosis for this audience. So my destiny was to take my year fellowship at Rancho Las Amigas Hospital in Downey, California, and return to the Hospital for Special Surgery in order to update the surgical treatment of particularly post-polio scoliosis patients or patients with respiratory problems secondary to neurological disease and other kinds of diseases. So it was Vernon Nickel who, with Philip Wilson Jr., orchestrated my agenda for the year, working with, it turned out to be Jacqueline Perry entirely for the whole year. Vernon Nickel was a great coach. He knew a lot about a lot of different things in orthopedics and rehabilitation. He was a great thinker and somebody that his students looked up to. Jacqueline Perry was a very hard worker. She was a thinker. She was devoted to her patients, and she was one of a kind. She had unusual energy. I had a difficult time at the age of 30 to keep up with her. She was a bit older than I was. The surgical theater started at 7:30 in the morning, and in California, in this hospital, the day ended at around 4 in the afternoon. Almost all of her scoliosis patients were dependent upon some type of aid in breathing. Rancho originally had many respirators, Drinker respirators and Emerson respirators, that the post-polio patients were kept in almost full-time to assist their breathing. And then the whole approach to this problem changed. And Perry initiated tracheostomy and ventilators that were attached directly to the tracheostomy, so that these large other tank respirators were discontinued. She was able to operate on any patient with any respiratory problem with the use of these ventilators, and she used different methods. You could not use a tight cast, so many of the casts were loose casts with attachments to halos through an outrigger. Wires would be brought out through the skin after being attached to the base of the spinous process and attached to a tubing which would be attached to it's a metal tubing with banjo screws on them and attached to the halo outrigger. Every day you would tighten up these wires and the curve would become reduced until eventually the decision was made to reoperate, insert Harrington rods, and remove the wires. There was very little infection, if any, from this method. Perry's background was a little bit unusual. She was one of the few women to rise as an orthopedic surgeon in the United States in the mid-1950s. She worked closely with Vernon Nickel. She earned her bachelor's degree in physical education from the University of California, and then in 1940 then joined the Army and trained to be a physical therapist. She earned her medical degree from the University of California, San Francisco in 1950 and completed her residency in San Francisco when she was recruited by the Rancho Rehabilitation Center. And she made this one of the outstanding hospitals for rehabilitation and post-polio patients in the world. She died in 2013 at the age of 94. In 1969, John Hall became the second president of the SRS. Mo had served 3 terms as president of the SRS, and the length of term was to change from 2 years to 1 year. Here you can see a picture of John Hall with Bob Winter in the background. On John Hall's right is yours truly, and on his left is Konstantin Veliskakis, who was a fellow and an attending at our hospital for a number of years and assisted John Cobb in many surgical procedures. In 1970, Dean McEwen became president-elect, and John Hall was president for the second year. I became secretary-elect, and finally, in 1971, McEwen took over as president for 2 years, and I started my 4-year term as secretary-treasurer, which ended up as just secretary when we split the office. Here is an early photograph of Dean with Yves Cottrell from Burke-Plage in France. Cottrell was very instrumental in his method of operative scoliosis. He ran a large hospital of scoliosis patients in the northern part of France, and I've watched him operate. In those days, they monitored the blood pressure and pulse only by a pulsimeter and not blood pressure, and he arbitrarily gave a pint of blood every hour to the patient. He started the French Scoliosis Research Society in about in the middle or later 1960s, and I had attended the first session. I think Bob Winter was there, and I gave a paper which I first spoke in French, having had 1 year of French in high school. The 1973 meeting was hosted by Alf Nachmanson in Gothenburg, Sweden, and Paul Harrington served as the president. It was the first meeting outside of the United States or Canada, and there was a lot of work in preparing this meeting, for in those days, as you recall or would know, that there were no communications by email, and we had to rely on the postal service or a telephone, which was very expensive. Nachmanson organized an outstanding scientific program, and his wife Renee helped with wonderful social activities, including many different kinds of herring dishes. The highlight of the meeting was a tour of the Volvo automobile factory with a presentation on automobile safety in the company's plush auditorium. Nachmanson acted as a consultant to the Volvo Corporation. Alf and his wife Renee became very close friends of my wife Janet and myself. He spent a lot of time in the United States, a lot of time in Canada. Alf loved being over here and had apartments in many different states over the years. He asked my wife and I if we would be willing to take on his daughter, his oldest daughter, who was 14, for 6 months to live with us in Westchester and go to school there, and of course we were delighted and pleased to do so. She was wearing a Milwaukee brace for scoliosis, so I had very close contact with a teenager in a Milwaukee brace. We had our own 3 children, but they were younger than she was. Our son, the next one down, was 13. It was a real experience and something that we're very honored to have done. That year, the Scoliosis Research Society became an affiliate of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. A glossary of terms was submitted by Ted Waugh, who is chair of terminology, and it was accepted for distribution. Waugh introduced his scoliosis inclinometer, manufactured by Wright. Alan McKelvey, who was from Scotland and one of the founding members, discussed with the Deputy Director of the National Institutes of Health in Washington, Ronald Lamont Havers, getting together with a meeting with the Scoliosis Research Society. We had 2 meetings, and the last one was attended by Winter, Harrington, Herndon of Cleveland, and myself. And they were designed to establish progressive dialogue with the NIH. Becoming secretary of the SRS opened many doors for me and introduced me to many people throughout the world. Some of these acquaintances became real friends and often visited our hospital in New York. I can recall a number of them, but important ones that I can recall are Arthur Hodgson, who's the professor in Hong Kong, known to his friends as Hottie. He revolutionized the management of tuberculosis of the spine, and he developed the anterior approach to this disease along with his associate Arthur Yao, who also became a professor at Hong Kong. Hodgson visited us in New York in the late 60s and stayed at our home in Westchester. At that time, my daughter was 3 years old, and we had dinner at home one evening. I made the dinner, and following that, it was a summer evening, and we were about to wash the dishes when Hadi said to us that he would like to wash the dishes, that we should go out for a walk. He had been on tour for a number of weeks and was somewhat homesick. I know that he had a number of children, I think 6 or 7 children, and his wife was Monica, who had been married for over 50 years. He died in 1975. Another close friend was Alan Dwyer. Alan Dwyer was from Sydney, Australia, and introduced his approach to scoliosis through the anterior approach, which was used for a number of years in the States. Dwyer visited us again and stayed with us in Westchester. I actually scrubbed with Dwyer on one of his procedures in Washington, D.C. after that, and was really taken back of how he could position his screws anteriorly. He added a lot to the armamentarium of scoliosis surgery. During these scoliosis years, I was assisted at the hospital and in scoliosis patients by Sheila Rubenstein, who herself was a patient in the 1950s. Here we can see a picture of Sheila getting an award at the scoliosis meeting in Gothenburg. She had traveled to that meeting, and then also afterwards we had a post-scoliosis annual meeting in Lyon, France, under Pierre Staniera. The January 1974 semi-annual meeting of the Board of Directors was very productive. Bob Winter outlined sites of the 1974 meeting in San Francisco, the 75 meeting in Louisville, 76 in Ottawa, and the 1977 meeting in Hong Kong. A proposed NIH workshop on scoliosis was approved. On March 1st, 1975, our president, Ken Leatherman, who took over for Bob Winter, received a number of committee reports. Winter, who is now the chair of the Committee on Scoliosis of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, submitted a schedule of courses. He also suggested formation of a long-range planning committee. Ron DeWald reported on 15 cases of malpractices from a survey of SRS members. President Ed Simmons' meeting in Ottawa in 1976 included a number of reports amending the bylaws and defining the types of membership. The Long-Range Planning Committee was concerned about the ultimate size of the society. A new booklet for the public, Replace Scoliosis, What's That?, and a sound slide program became available. Les Nash was chair of data retrieval and reported that 60 members are now contributing to computers in Houston, Texas. Lou Goldstein was elected president for the Hong Kong meeting in 1977, but had to step down after 2 months for health reasons. Kirk Ashley, the president-elect, took over the office of president and was president for 2 years. The 1979 meeting was hosted by myself, the new president of the Scoliosis Research Society. It was the 14th annual meeting, and the local host was Mar Mullen. Up until this meeting, the business meeting would be held in the middle of the day, cutting into the schedule of presentations. I had the idea to hold the business meeting for members at breakfast. This allowed the business meeting's privacy from non-members, added 1 hour to the recorded meeting time, and gave more prime time for business. This is the first meeting that this arrangement was made. It has been followed ever since by all subsequent presidents. After the SRS success with breakfast business meetings, many other societies introduced the breakfast business meeting concept. So ended the story of how the SRS started and its early development. Members of the SRS should be very grateful that our history has been preserved as well as it has been. There have been a number of our colleagues who have made this happen. Bob Keller, Dan Benson, Ron DeWald, John Moe, Sid Wallace, Ted Waugh, Bob Henziker have all been very important in one way or another, either as secretary or historian or chairman of the history committee, to help preserve this early history. But it was Bill Kane who set the foundation and was able to start the ball rolling so that we have ended up with this rich and preserved dialogue of the SRS. It was Mark Asher who was able to store all these archives, videos, photographs, documents, and organize them in such a wonderful way that we should all be appreciative to Mark, and everyone in our society should take time to look at the website. And our new historian, Baruch Agbarnia, has done a fine job in continuing to preserve these documents.
The Scoliosis Research Society is a nonprofit professional organization made up of physicians and allied health personnel. Their primary focus is on providing continuing medical education for healthcare professionals and on funding and supporting research in spinal deformities. Please visit srs.org for further information.